Well, in case the year couldn't go by any faster, it's already time for a brand new season. What's up, Summoners? I'm Kangas, and just for you, today we're going over a patch rundown of the start of Season 11. Like always, we'll cover every single change and also provide you a tier list curated by our in-house analysts. There's a lot to cover, but first, I am contractually obligated to share with you that we have a giveaway going on right now. We got Riot points, coaching points, and ProGuides subscriptions, and all you gotta do is click the link in the description down below to join. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video.
First up, let's mention the new skins this patch. Jumping aboard are 5 new skins to choose from between Marauder Callista, Kled, and Xin Zhao, as well as Warden Gragas and Quinn now being available for purchase. If you're a fan of the epic armor aesthetic, make sure to check them out and start the new season with one of these. Next up on the list are systems changes. Of course we needed these, right? What better time to have last-minute changes for items than right as the competitive season is underway? First up, Grievous Wounds items have been buffed. The duration has been increased from 2 to 3 seconds, so you're gonna get a lot more out of the effect. This change pertains to the following items: Bramble Vest, Chempunk Chainsword, Chemtech Purifier, Executioner's Calling, Morellonomicon, Mortal Reminder, Oblivion Orb, and Thornmail. The first specific item on our list is Runan's Hurricane. With its high price point, Runan's Hurricane has been a much harder item to purchase during the preseason. While powerful, it costs way too much gold, and to make it more accessible, Riot has made some bigger changes this patch. It now builds out of Double Dagger, Zeal, and 850 gold, leaving its total price tag at 2,500 like the other Zeal upgrades. However, it's lost its bonus AD, and the passive damage has been lowered from 40 to 70% to a flat 40. Weaker, but much easier to purchase, this item feels stronger because it's a much more reliable purchase these days. But of course, when you do manage to cap out and finish an entire build, you'll definitely be missing out a bit in the AD department. But the trade-off is there'll be more games where the cost reduction ends up being superior. Next is Ionian Boots of Lucidity, which has gotten a pretty nice buff. With the transition from cooldown reduction to ability haste this season, it's no surprise that these shoes just aren't as sweet of a pair of kicks as before. They've ended up feeling a little lackluster, and thus the ability haste has been increased from 15 to 20, and the summoner spell haste from 10 to 12. By the way, before we jump in any further, I do want to ask you guys what your thoughts are on today's question of the day. What's your favorite item right now, and why? For me as a support player, I'm loving Imperial Mandate because Bard and Maokai are just so fun to play right now, and yes, I'm a dirty Maokai abuser, I'm ashamed to admit it. Let us know your answer to the question in the comments down below. Now let's get back to the item changes. Manamune and Muramana received some changes previously to push them out of AP builds, but Riot feels like they slightly missed the mark. Thus, they've received another change this patch to hopefully make it a healthier item for its intended audience. Its recipe has been changed to Tier, Warhammer, Longsword, and 1,050 gold, leaving it at a total 2,900 gold purchase. Aw's passive bonus AD has been increased from 2% to 2.5% of max mana, but the shock damage has been lowered from 4 to 2.5%. Ultimately, the item will essentially be stronger if you also have a lot of attack speed or if your abilities have very powerful AD ratios. Otherwise, it will still be weaker, meaning that it'll be especially weaker on mages. However, the change that made it so only physical damage spells could apply has been reverted because the restricted access was hurting many of its intended users. I'm looking at you, Ezreal. Next up is Trinity Force. The AD has been lowered from 35 to 25, and the ability haste increased from 10 to 20. As a Spellblade item, Trinity Force should encourage champions to rely on both their abilities as well as their basic attacks. This balance change should solidify Trinity Force's identity as an item for champions who rely on multiple ways to deal damage, rather than just solely slapping their enemies over and over again. Hextech Rocket Belt is another mythic item that's gotten a change. To address the excessive amount of burst damage in the game, it had its active damage lowered and shifted onto other stats instead. The AP has been increased from 80 to 90, health from 250 to 350, and the active damage lowered from a range of 175 to 250 down to 125 flat. I'm mostly curious on how this will affect the wave clear uses of the item, but we'll have to see. Like Hextech Rocket Belt, Night Harvester has also gotten changes for the exact same reasons. Its AP has also been increased from 80 to 90, health from 250 to 300, and passive damage decreased from 125 to 200 down to 125 flat. Oh, Gore Drinker, everyone's favorite bruiser item. It was absolutely on the list of active effects that needed a nerf, but the changes are actually a bit different here. Thirsting Slash's damage has been lowered from 110% AD down to just 100% AD. Its healing, however, has for some reason been increased from 20% AD plus 12% missing health to 25% AD plus 12% missing health. One notable change though is that the healing is now calculated sequentially. To simplify that statement, each heal is counted separately. So previously, if you hit 5 enemy champions, you would get one flat giant heal based on whatever health you were at. But now it'll count as 5 separate heals, so each time it heals you, it'll be a little less than before since you've technically recovered some of that missing health already. In these big team fights, it's a pretty big nerf, but in the cases of 1v1s, this is actually going to be a buff. So be wary of the top lane bruisers when they're split pushing. We've also got to throw a Stride Breaker into the mix. Its AD has been lowered from 50 down to 45, ability haste increased from 10 to 20, and active damage lowered from 110% AD to 100% AD. Duskblade of Drakthar is also on the list. The AD has been increased from 55 to 60, while its passive damage has been lowered from 100 plus 30% bonus AD to 65 plus 25% bonus AD. That one's pretty big. Prowler's Claw has gotten nearly identical treatment as the ability haste has been increased from 10 to 20, while the passive damage has been decreased from 100 plus 30% bonus AD to, again, 65 plus 25% bonus AD. Feels like overall Riot's trying to remove a lot of the damage from item passives and instead put those into the stats of the items themselves. That means that champions will feel more strong without relying on that extra passive or active on the item. Shurelia's Battle Song wasn't getting as much love as a support mythic item, and it's also gotten a nice buff this patch. The movement speed bonus from the active has been increased from 40% to 60%. A pretty big buff that I'm sure Rakan players will love as they want to go fast. Or if you're like me on Rakan, they'll just run it down harder than before. Archangel's Staff is another item that's been buffed this patch. Its AP has been increased by 5, but more importantly, it's received a very nice change to its build path. The excess Sapphire Crystal in the recipe has been changed to an Amplifying Tome. This is a great change because, honestly, you already have Tear, so you don't need even more mana when you're trying to finish the item. You can now build a little more AP along the way, so the journey should be a little less bumpy than before. Also, the AW AP percentage for mana has been reduced from 3 to 2%. Let's start with the top lane changes. Gangplank did receive a hotfix change in the middle of last patch. Gangplank's AD per level went up from 3 to 4, while Malphite's base MR was reduced from 32 to 28. One actual significant change at the top lane, which is a little surprising, is Gnar. His Q's Megaform slow has been increased from 13 to 35% up to 30 to 50%, and his Miniform E's attack speed bonus duration increased from 4 up to 6 seconds. On top of that, his Megaform's E range also increased from 600 to 675. Overall, I actually really like these changes. They should give Gnar many more tools to work with. His punish game will be so much more threatening now, and he'll have a lot more to worry about when playing against Mega Gnar because of the massive buff to his Q slow. It's still not technically hard CC, but it definitely hits harder. Gnar is one of those champs that just keeps getting these little buffs over and over again and eventually might tip the scale to be OP, but for now, he's still going to be sitting in the B tier. Our analysts believe that these might be enough for him to push into the A tier eventually once players get used to it, but we don't want to jump the gun and get our hopes up too quickly. Next is a nerf to Pantheon. His health regen has gone down from 10 to 9, and his empowered Q's scaling has been reduced from the range of 135 to 165 down to 120 to 165%. This early game nerf will have some impact, but he'll still deal incredible damage, and we'll leave him as an OP pick for now. Next up, let's take a second to also talk about notable picks in the top lane right now. Sion, Kayle, and Nasus have been moved into the A tier since our last tier list. Nasus is an outlier here, as in low elo, he's an S or even S plus tier pick. However, in Platinum and higher, his power falls off immensely and he turns into more of a mediocre champ. Sion has proven himself as an acceptable tank to play, as he has enough tankiness and damage to pump out decent results in the current meta. Kayle, as always, is still a late game monster, and when picked in good matchups, can absolutely solo carry games like always. Our OP picks in the top lane are currently Pantheon and Malphite, followed up by Aatrox, Shen, Wukong, Darius, Camille, and Maokai in the S tier. It's a little crowded, but Aatrox definitely takes the top spot in the S tier list. High elo players especially have recognized his strength, and while he's not the kind of champion to dominate every single game, he's once again one of the most reliable champions with all the new items. I'm looking at you, Gore Drinker. You can always rely on him to have impact on games, and that in itself is a great strength. Meanwhile, Malphite has been moved up to the OP tier list once again because he's still dominating in spite of nerfs to his MR. A big reason behind this is that not many AP champions are able to survive in the top lane right now. They feel a bit too risky because if that Malphite you're trying to counterpick ends up randomly going mid, you're gonna have a very rough time in the top lane island. Next up, let's run through the jungle. Kayn and Olaf were also hotfix changed last patch. Kayn's armor went up from 35 to 38, and his Q's damage was increased from 65 to 145 up to 75 to 155. Olaf's Q slow was decreased from 29 to 45 to 25 to 45%, and his W's attack speed bonus lowered from 55 to 95 down to 50 to 90. And aside from a 0.005 change to his AD per level, Fiddlesticks has gotten an actual nerf this patch. His W's cooldown has been increased from 9 to 7 seconds to 10 to 8 seconds. While this is a more medium-sized nerf, we think he'll remain around the same power level and we'll keep him in the B tier for now. Our analysts actually think that he could be an A tier pick, but this small nerf should be enough to move him down one. Next up, Ivern has also been nerfed. His Q's cooldown has been reverted back to 14 to 10 seconds, while his E's shield ratio has been lowered from 90% AP to 80%. In spite of this, he still retains his E's cooldown buff, as well as Daisy's attack speed buff from last patch. So, despite some of the nerfs, we'll actually still move him up to the S tier. The buffs to support items alongside direct buffs were a bit overkill last patch, but even with these slight nerfs, he's still much stronger than he was at the start of preseason. The hammer has been dropped, and Graves is finally up for a nerf. After being a top tier Titan for quite some time now, he's lost a whopping 2 AD. We'll leave Graves in the OP tier for now, but ironically, this small nerf might actually be what drops him down to the S tier because he's honestly been on that line for quite some time. 2 less AD might not seem like a lot, but that will affect his early jungle clear. Next up, Taliyah has had her passive movement speed decreased from 20 to 45% down to 12 to 40%. Taliyah did get some massive changes to her Q pretty recently that caused her to instantly become viable in the jungle. More than that actually, she became quite the powerhouse after a single buff, and Riot has taken some steps to make sure Summoner's Rift doesn't revert back to a rocky one-woman Taliyah show like a certain past patch did. However, we've still decided to move Taliyah up a notch because she's definitely a strong enough pick to merit it now. Finally, Master Yi's Q cooldown has been increased from 18 to 14 seconds to 18 to 16 seconds, alongside some very minor changes to his base stats. We've moved him into the A tier, but we actually have something else to say about him. Let's talk about the shifts we've made since last time. Amumu and Master Yi are 2 power picks that we want to talk about in particular. These 2 are low elo monsters, and while we've placed them in the A tier, their placement is extremely subjective and based on your own rank. In low elo, these 2 are the types of champions that will absolutely dominate games because players just aren't able to efficiently punish them. They're absolutely S tier when they can free farm and do whatever they want, but are more disappointing picks in high elo games where games are much less forgiving. Lilia, meanwhile, is the exact opposite. We've kept her in the A tier because lower elo players especially just haven't been finding good results with her. In fact, her statistics overall are just disappointing. But the majority of high elo players will tell you that they think she's strong, and you should ignore her 47% win rate. Lilia's clear speed is incredible. Her damage output is also very powerful, and she can be quite troublesome to play against because of her mobility. The thing about Lilia is that she's sort of an oddball. First off, it takes patience, and especially it requires a little more thinking when playing with or as one. Her ultimate can be really tricky to utilize effectively, and solo queue teams just lack the coordination and understanding to utilize this powerful ability to its full potential, kinda like TSM. However, we're going to hold off on rating her in the S tier because of this exact reason. You can't count on your teammates consistently, and more straightforward champions that just one-shot your enemies are generally stronger in solo queue, which is in direct contrast to Lilia's gradual burn-to-death type of fighting. So in the S tier, we will be featuring some new faces with Taliyah, Elise, and Ivern. As promised, Taliyah and Ivern have made the cut, and our analysts speculate whether or not Ivern is actually an OP pick. His play rate is far too low for us to make that call just yet, but he's strong, and with a buff to support items, he's shining as a potential superstar jungler. Yep, we're going towards that meta. I can't believe we've come to a time when I can say that. The OP tier list now consists of Olaf, Graves, Kha'Zix, and Nunu, followed by Kayn falling just short of glory and into the S tier alongside Evelynn, Rammus, Echo, Hecarim, Taliyah, Elise, and Ivern. So that wraps up the jungle. Let's go into the mid lane next. In the mid-patch update last patch, Akali did receive some changes as well. Her base AD was lowered from 62.4 down to a flat 62, and her passive movement speed lowered from 40 to 70 down to 30 to 60. Passive damage was also lowered from 39 to 180 to 29 to 170, and AP ratio lowered from 50% to 40%. Micro changes aside this patch, Anivia's E damage was lowered from 60 to 180 down to 50 to 170, and its mana cost increased from 40 to 50 in the mid-patch update on 10.25 as well. Next up, Galio got a pretty big W cooldown nerf, as the cooldown was increased from 16 to 12 seconds to 18 to 16 seconds in that same update. Starting off some of the bigger changes, we have Qiyana. Her base AD has been increased from 64 to 66, while her HP regen has gone up from 8.5 to 9.5, and HP regen per level from 0.65 to 0.9. Yeah, these numbers are much bigger than the other micro changes that the other champions received. We don't think the buffs are going to be enough to push Qiyana up a tier, but unlike other champions, you'll be able to notice that Qiyana is a bit stronger in lane now. Meanwhile, Ryze's Q damage cost has also been lowered from 40 to 32 based on level. Not a giant buff, but it'll help out in the mid game where you're spamming your Qs during fights and skirmishes. Ryze will also retain his B tier placement for now. Next up is a pretty big adjustment for Yasuo. His AD per level was lowered from 3.2 down to 2.2. Also, his passive now increases crit strike chances from all sources by 150% instead of 100%. Excess critical strike to AD conversion has also been lowered from 0.5 per 1% to 0.4 per 1% in compensation. Overall, this actually creates a lot more build diversity because you'll be getting so much more crit chance than before. If instead you choose to continue building excessive amounts of crit, you won't be punished very hard either because you'll still gain quite a bit of bonus AD from the conversion. Honestly, whether this change is a buff or nerf will depend heavily on your build path and how much crit you want. Yasuo has lost a lot of AD per level, so if you were barely scraping by and barely exceeding 100% crit to begin with, note that you'll have a little less AD now than before. We'll keep Yasuo in the S tier, however, because you can now reach 100% crit chance with only 40% through your items. We think this will really shake things up in terms of build diversity. Wait, this doesn't mean Tank Yasuo is back, right? Oh god. Meanwhile, Yone has also received the exact same changes, except his AD per level went from 3 to 2. With the exact same reasoning, we'll also leave him in the S tier. Feels bad that there's not too much to add to this, but it's honestly just kind of cool how Riot is essentially copy and pasting any changes that the two of these receive. In spite of these changes, we only have one big one to note for a mid lane tier list. We've swapped Echo and Zed on the list. First off, the reason we moved Zed down is because of the change to Duskblade. It's lost a lot of its burst damage, and its scaling has also gone down. In comparison, Hextech Rocket Belt did lose some damage to the active, but it received a buff to both its AP and its health. Hextech Rocket Belt is also a one and done during teamfights. You only get one shot with it. On the other hand, Duskblade can act as a multi-kill item, activating multiple times throughout the fight, so the nerf will be more noticeable. While we do think Zed is still top tier, we think Echo will narrowly be able to take his spot in the OP tier list. But of course, we'll make sure to update you guys through this on our mid-patch update. By the way, if you're interested in learning any of these sorts of champions, make sure to go check out our website, ProGuides.com, because we got a ton of coaches who can help you out. Assassins can be tricky, and there's no shame in admitting that, so if you want to get better at Zed, go check out one of our coaches, they'll help you out. So our OP picks from the mid lane are Echo, Pantheon, Anivia, and Fizz, followed up by Zed, Akali, Victor, Annie, Katarina, Galio, Malphite, Yone, Yasuo, and Seraphine in the S tier. Next up, let's talk about the bot lane. One champion who's been underperforming heavily is Sivir. Preseason has not done her justice, and she's received a medium-sized buff this patch. First up, Sivir's base mana has been increased from 284 to 325, and her Q damage increased from 35 to 95 plus 70 to 130% bonus AD up to 40 to 100 plus 75 to 135% bonus AD. We don't think that this is enough to move her up a tier, but it's a start and I'm optimistic. If this buff was just a little bit bigger, I do think she could pass as a B tier pick because of how much utility she brings to the table. The next thing to push her over the edge is if games start to go a little longer, so, be wary of her at next season. So yeah, here at ProGuides, we got pretty excited when Varus got some buffs to bring him back, and they did pan out too well, so now he's getting even more. His Q's mana cost has been reduced by 5 and the cooldown lowered from 18 to 10 seconds to 16 to 10 seconds. These are pretty small buffs, so we'll leave him at the C tier for now. Now, let's talk about Xayah. Her E's damage has been lowered from 12 to 8 down to 10 to 8, while the mana cost was lowered from 40 to 30. Xayah has honestly been falling behind the pack quite a bit. A big part of this is that the items this season just aren't as good on her. While Essence Reaver is a natural fit for her in theory, her cooldowns feel a bit too long to utilize the Spellblade passive optimally. That change has made it much less effective on Xayah, and it takes a bit too long for her to scale up as a result. If you are looking for champions that scale, you'd probably do better looking elsewhere. Navori Quick Blades is an incredible power spike for Xayah that often comes a bit too late into the game for it to even matter. I personally don't think that lowering the early game cooldown on her E will have much of an impact on her, and we'll keep her in the C tier list for now. I think that any massive changes to her statistics will have to come from her player base and innovating a gold efficient build that also allows Xayah to keep up with her enemies at all points of the game. So again, we're leaving Xayah in the C tier. Next, let's talk about other changes to the list. First up, one thing our analysts would like to note is that Kalista is looking much stronger this patch. They believe that the massive cost reduction on Runaan's Hurricane will help out Kalista a ton and will keep her on their watch list. While Kalista has been an overall underwhelming pick this preseason, things might just turn around for her with a single change. She's always been a champion who tries to hit her 2-item power spike and then fight relentlessly, so having that lower cost on Runaan's will help a lot. She does well when she gives her enemies as little time to farm as possible and makes play after play to close out games. Before, when your second item was a crit strike modifier and cost 3,400 gold, you're going to be sitting on your hands and waiting for that power spike for quite a while. 900 gold cheaper is a much more feasible thing for Kalista to work around, and we expect her to get stuff done much earlier now. Next up, Lucian has been moved into the B tier. While mobile and safe, you're basically tightrope walking whenever you pick him. If you can't establish a lead, you fall off quickly, and things can get really rough. He's not a terrible pick, and when executed well, can absolutely carry games. Though, since the results can be rather inconsistent because of how well you need to play with him, we moved him to the B tier to illustrate this. We actually needed to move Ezreal down after those Muramana nerfs last patch. It was harder for Ezreal to utilize its effect as some of the spells deal magic damage. While after the changes this patch, Ezreal will still deal less damage than he originally did, but we think having more access to the item should help him out enough to stay in the A tier at least. Our OP picks for the bot lane are Jhin, Kai'Sa, and Miss Fortune, followed up by SAMIRA, Ashe, and Vayne in the S tier. Just note that SAMIRA is walking on thin ice. While her ban rates are still incredibly high, the recent nerfs to her passive have made her much more reliant on her lane partner. A lot of SAMIRA's strength comes from her ability to act independently and essentially carry as a one-woman show. More reliant on others now, she's lost some of that power. Player frustration remains at an all-time high, however, as her ban rate is still excessively high, and we do think she's still a powerful pick overall, just not nearly as ridiculous or broken as her release. Now, let's wrap things up with supports. Now, Karma also received a massive buff to her E as the shield was increased from 80 to 200 up to 80 to 240. Karma's been struggling massively during preseason, but with this buff to her shield, she should be able to find a place as a shielding bot, as sad as that sounds. But these buffs aren't enough to really bump her anywhere, so she's staying in the C tier for now. Finally, while we've been banking on players, figuring out Rel and boosting her win rate up, it appears that things didn't go quite as planned. We've moved Rel down into the B tier and attribute this to the risk involved with playing her. Rel has a pretty powerful kit with tons of great utility, however, this utility doesn't have the same impact in every game and depends on what supportive champions the enemy team brings or if their carries have shielding built into their kit, like the case of Riven, Yasuo, or Yone. Also, the long cooldown on Rel's W means that if you whiff, you're going to end up in a pretty bad spot for a while. In contrast, other champions don't usually end up stuck in the same sense as Rel. Thus, our OP picks for supports are Leona, Lulu, Thresh, and Maokai, followed up by Bard, Morgana, Nami, Janna, Alistar, Brand, Nautilus, Seraphine, and Pantheon in the S tier. Maokai has been a titan this preseason, and he'll continue to look extremely strong with his Imperial Mandate and Demonic Embrace build. The immense damage and crowd control he brings to teams is absolutely insane, and if you haven't played preseason, he's a pick you need to watch out for.
Well, that'll wrap up our patch 11.1 rundown. Congratulations if you made it through the whole thing, and if you didn't, well, I didn't need you anyway. For those that did and enjoy the content, please make sure to hit that like button and sub to the channel if you haven't already. It all helps us out a ton. And also don't forget to join the Discord giveaway in the description down below. Until next time, as always, good luck on the Rift, stay hydrated, and wash those hands. I'll see you next time.